Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another live stream on History Podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor Markus Vinzent. And today we're going to be talking about Marcion. What do we know about the man Marcion himself? So welcome back to the show, Markus.
Thanks so much for inviting me again. Yeah,
thank you for coming on. So first of all, can you kind of give us a recap on who Marcion, the person, is for those that have not seen your prior interviews on this channel, and for those that actually don't even know about Marcion at all?
Yeah, which I think in this case wouldn't be a surprise because Marcion of Sinope has been a person forgotten in history, if you like, because quite early on, people who disagreed with him tried to push him to the sides. And somehow he fell aside of at least the history as it's been told. But before we enter into details, he was, just to give you a broad outline, he is somebody who has lived in the 2nd century, probably been born just before the turn from the 1st to the 2nd century. And from what we know, he must have been dead in the 160s. So roughly first part of the 2nd century and peak of his work around the middle of the 2nd century. Now, why is he still known and why do we show on him today here on History Channel? He was always known throughout history for those people who were specialists as one of the arch heretics. So one of the great guys who challenged the early Christian movement and the church, and who was supposed to have been excluded from this church early on during his lifetime. And that's the story that runs from the late 2nd century, becomes bigger and bigger, and he becomes even more the heretic. What a heretic is somebody who has been excluded from the church. And so he enters into the school books and was present and is present in most heads and hearts of the people who deal with these subjects today. But why was he called a heretic? I mean, what was the big heresy, the big belief for which he was castigated and extradited? Still the story, we will come to the potential realities behind these stories. The story runs that he has cut down the canonical New Testament and produced his own New Testament. So against the canon of the church on which Christianity today relies upon, the New Testament with its 27 books, he challenged. And according to those people who have written against the heretics, he was the big challenge against this New Testament of Christians. He cut it down according to these voices and the story, gnawed it down as a mouse. That was the description by Tertullian of him, and just left the New Testament with only one gospel out of 4 and with only 10 letters from the 14 letters that we know of Paul. He dismissed Acts, he dismissed all the rest of the letters and of Revelation of the New Testament. Hence, he ends up with a very small New Testament of just 11 books, to which he adds his own preface. In that preface, he shows that the New Testament has nothing to do with the Old Testament, just like the Christian God has nothing to do with the Jewish God. So Judaism is separate from Christianity. Christianity has nothing to do with Jews, with their beliefs, and with Judaism. And even the letters of Paul and the gospel that he chose, he cut down and just left it with what suited his own interest. So that's the story. In fact, what we know is that he was probably the most discussed and disputed scholar in the first 4 to 5 centuries of our era, within Christianity. So he was not just the arch heretic as the story was told, but he was even the biggest heretic, that person against whom Christianity had to strive. A great scholar of patristic studies and New Testament studies, a German by the name of Adolf von Harnack, he spent almost his lifetime working on Marcion. As a young student, he wrote a prize dissertation, which has only recently been published, which was on Marcion. But his major work on Marcion of Sinope he published once he went to retirement age. And in it, he brought together almost all the sources that we have on Marcion's life. So despite some of the corrections that we would like to make today, this is a standard book, Adolf von Harnack on Marcion. It's also, at least parts of it, is translated into English, so you will find it. And in this, Adolf von Harnack compares him to Martin Luther as one of the most important reform people in church's history. And without doubt, we can discuss whether his thesis and theory is correct, but without doubt, Marcion, during his lifetime already, and shortly after his death, was one of the people had to deal with. I've just looked again into what we know, who has written about him. And you cannot imagine, but within the first 100 years, which means first century, he didn't live very well, he was just a child. But in the 2nd century, we know at least already about 12 monographs or single works that had been written about, partially against him or to him. So an enormous amount of literature, if you reckon with a relatively small Christian community. So we have 12 single books written about and against and to him. We have even approximately the same number of people who in other works about heretics, about the interpretation of writings or about Christians and Christian practice are also talking about him. It reads almost like a who's who of early Christian authors when you look into who had dealt with him, with his views, so that if you haven't under an understanding of who he was, you will see from this kind of broad range of people who are engaging with him that he was one of the most important, if not the most important author of early Christianity outside, let's say, the canonical literature that becomes, of course, more and more important in the 3rd centuries and later.
And what did Marcion believe?
That's a very good question. Before we go into the realia, we have to admit that his New Testament has not survived. There were too many people in the 3rd century and later who were against his teachings and his views. So we have to dig out the views that he has from primarily the lost works that we have, just in narrations of those people who were against him. So we have to be very cautious when it comes to thinking what he believed and before making statements. I wouldn't go as far as Judith Liu, who has written a book on him as a heretic in the views of those people who write about heretics, because in the first part of her very big monograph, she explains that every author who writes about him produces his own version of what Marcion believed. And yet it is interesting to see that in the second half of her monograph, she does the same thing by trying to then recuperate from those opinions of the others what Marcion might have believed himself. So with this caveat, let me also answer the question. And I would rather draw, first of all, on Marcion's New Testament. This New Testament has not been entirely reconstructed yet. We have not enough information about the preface that he wrote to his work, although Tertullian, who is an author, Latin writing author from the beginning of the 3rd century, has given us an enormously big volume of work, actually in 5 volumes, where he describes systematically in 3 books the theology and the thinking of Marcion, to then in his book 4 and book 5 give us a commentary in book 4, a commentary on his preface plus the one gospel that I mentioned, and in book 5 he then gives us a commentary on the 10 letters of Paul that Marcion had included in his New Testament. And let me answer the question that Jacob has asked me. What did Marcion believe by simply looking at his New Testament? Because in addition to this New Testament, actually nothing is known of what he has written in addition. Probably a letter, but that's all. So this is his major work, which again shows already that everybody who has written about him and against him and in favor of him is writing about this collection of a New Testament. One of the clearest statements, I think, is what Tertullian gives us as a report about the preface. The title of the preface, as Tertullian knows it, and some other people also report about it, was called The Contradictions. Quite an interesting title. What is he contradicting with? So what is and why is he opposing himself against what? The biggest opposition that he states is that the collection he has brought together, particularly the gospel that he brought together and the 10 letters of Paul, had been contradicted. How? He claims that other people, so colleagues of his, had nicked his texts, the gospel and the Pauline letters, had reworked them, had produced copies, but changed the text. Not only that, he says that these other copies of his text, had been put under the names of authorities, 2 apostles and 2 students of apostles. And we can reckon it is Matthew and John, and it is Mark and Luke. And likewise, these people who have altered his gospel and produced rogue copies of his gospel, and who had also altered the texts of his letters of Paul, that these people had attempted to join these texts to the Jewish Bible. Whereas Marcion, and that's the first strong belief, whereas Marcion had believed, according to the end of his preface, that Judaism, and this is probably one of the very first, or at least early mentions of the entity of the title, Judaism. We only have 2 more sources where you will find the abstract noun Judaism in those times. And this is the book of 2nd Maccabees and the book of 4 Maccabees. And we're not sure whether the title of Judaism has not been written into these 2 texts by Christians. But may that, as it is, it could have been a self-description of Jews around the same time. But it's very rare. Daniel Boyarin has advocated that the abstract notion of Judaism is rather an invention of Christians than a self-description of Jews. And I think it could well be that Daniel is right. And if that were correct, then probably Marcion is not only the first one to create the word Judaism, but he would also be the very first to have created and coined the name of Christianity. And these two he sets into oppositions, hence the title of his book. And it is the last of the oppositions that he creates and brings together. Because he says, according to that preface, that one has to differentiate between the transcendent God he believes in, who he thinks is the Father of Christ, of Jesus Christ. And one has to differentiate the Creator God of the Jews, who is not to be identified with this God and Father of Jesus Christ. Whereas God, the Father of Christ, is a transcendent God, which means he is absolutely beyond this world and hasn't created this world. Only sent Christ into this world to rescue the world and with it human beings. But he believes that this Christ has also nothing to do with the Messiah and the Christ of the Jews. So in fact, we have two different belief systems. One is what is being believed by Jews in Judaism, who believe in God, who is a creator of this world, who has promised through his prophets a future Messiah, and that this future Messiah is to come to restore the state and the status of Israel. In contrast, Marcion believes into a divine figure who was unknown in history, who hasn't predicted anything, but out of the blue, out of heaven, he has sent his envoy, the Lord, Jesus Christ, who then appeared on earth like an apocalypse. And in this appearance, he tried to rescue this world out of the hands of the Creator and out of the hands of those who believe in him. Now, this startling contrast has also a lot of knock-on effects. It means that Christians do not believe into the Torah. They do not believe in the Nevi'im, in the prophets, and in the writings of Judaism. Judaism has got its own set of holy writings, whereas Christians, and this is the reason why he puts together a gospel, he collects the material that he believes is the foundational material for Christianity, one gospel and these 10 Pauline letters that he gets together. And he believes that this is for Christians the foundation and the basis on which this new cult, a new practice, and new belief is going to work. He does not distinguish in a way that or rejects Judaism. So he's not an anti-Jew. He's not an anti-Semite. On the contrary, he wants to safeguard that the Jews have their own area of belief and scriptures. But he claims for his own cult that Christians are based on the new revelation, an unknown revelation before, which is encompassed in this New Testament. Hence, he claims that there is an Old Testament and a New Testament, and the novelty of the New Testament mirrors the novelty of the Torah, of the new law, of what he thinks is the core of the new law, which are the Sermon of the Plain or the Sermon of the Mountain. So we could go into more detail what he then has to say and to believe, but I think this is, to sum up, the greatest novelty of his belief.
Is there any evidence that Marcion derived his beliefs from anyone before him, or did he come up with this on his own?
It is always difficult to think for creative thinkers not to have had predecessors. Nobody comes from heaven except for Marcion's Christ. So we have to believe that he had people who had helped him to develop his ideas. But we have to distinguish between what later heresiologists, as we call these people who write and most of the time create heretics. Now, they claim that Marcion had predecessors who were already heretics. I don't believe that we can follow that line, because whoever is being mentioned as a predecessor, already a heretical predecessor of Marcion, we don't know anything about these people. It is rather a typical way how heresiologists try to establish a kind of a genealogy of heretical people. You can see that in people like Hippolytus, who refer Marcion back to the Greek philosopher Empedocles. But then we don't know, if we look into what is being said about Marcion, or even in his New Testament, as far as we can reconstruct it, that there is much Empedoclean philosophy in his writings. And so it is with other ways and attempts to relate Marcion back to earlier thinkers. I think from the writings that we can reconstruct, there is a Stoic background, which we can see in many of the notions that we get in the Gospel and also in the 10 letters of Paul. And of course, as these protagonists of his two writing sets show, he himself refers his knowledge back to the letters of Paul that he has got hold of, and the information that was brought together by him, as far as he says, in the Gospel. So he would relate himself back to Paul, first of all, and also to Christ in the Gospel. And with regards to Paul, of course, he even states that Paul is the only apostle he trusts in, because he thinks that only Paul has got the message right. He is the only one we can trust, and who has that knowledge through an apocalypse, through in a revelation himself. Again, which is a very typical way how people in antiquity who have created a new cult, and Marcion was not the only one. There were a number of people who, from the 2nd and 3rd century before our era, and he was not the latest one, are creating new forms of religious worship. And all of them, to answer the question again, draw on earlier material, not necessarily on one single figure. One of the backgrounds, of course, of Marcion is quite clear. He must come from an environment which was predominantly Jewish. Stoic, yes, in the terms of philosophy. Roman, of course, as well. He lives in the Roman Empire. But I think the closest we can get is that he comes from potentially a proselyte Jewish family, which means a Greek Roman family who had close links to the Jewish community and was even part of it, as far as proselytes can be part of a Jewish community. Where I take that from is predominantly from Tertullian's commentary. because it is noticeable, and I'm not the first one, Adolf von Harnack already saw it, that in a number of ways, Tertullian talks often about proselytism and proselyte backgrounds when he talks about Marcion. So he assumes, apparently, that Marcion has come from a Jewish background, and on the basis of that Jewish background, developed his own ideas. And this we can see, because despite his saying about the oppositions between Judaism and Christianity, he sees Christianity as a form of a Jewish belief, even though he reserves Judaism as a different, even an opposite movement from Christianity. But it is a form of Judaism which is not so much linked to the old Jewish Torah, but it is linked to a belief in a Messiah. It is linked to a second coming of that Messiah at the end of times. It is linked to a kind of retribution, which, unlike his form of Judaism that he has in mind, is not a form of judgment at the end of time, but of a restoration of everything. And so you can see it is a form of Judaism which comes closer to what we know from the Pharisees and from what we know later from the rabbis. And in that sense, I'd say we have even three forms of Jewish beliefs. One is the old Jewish tradition of the Torah. And in the Torah, for example, there is no belief in an afterlife. Within the 5 books of Moses, we read only that after death, there is death. The only way to survive is through offspring, and only men can survive because only male offspring can bring futures. So it is a patriarchal form of a life and a belief in this worldly life. In the Torah, we neither find the idea of a Messiah, even not of a paradise, and certainly not of a future judgment or of a second coming of the Messiah. So this is the old Jewish tradition. When Marcion talks about Judaism, he doesn't mean this old Jewish form, but he means the type of Pharisaic Judaism, which encompasses a belief in the Messiah, encompasses a belief in the future coming and in retribution and judgment and a last battle. And for him, Christianity is, if you like, a reform, a new form of this Pharisaic type of Judaism. And he sets the opposition between this type of modern form, at the time at least, of modern form of a Jewish belief, and the way he sees Christianity as a Jewish form of belief. So it is a bit complex and complicated when we see that we are dealing with, if you like, with at least 3 types of Jewish practices and belief systems, whereas Christianity is still, as he says, as the most novel form of that type of Jewish belief, where he believes in a Messiah. But now he says this Messiah of Christians is not concerned about the reformation of the status of Israel, but it is a rescue action and a practice of rescue for everybody in this world. So it's a universal type of religion. And that makes it align with the Roman way of thinking, that they have a mission for this world, just as Christians develop a mission for this entire world. And we can see, if we think back of the origins of this belief, it is, yes, as I said, Stoic, it is Jewish, it is Roman. And the 3 brought together is set in a new form and a new revelatory belief system. And these types of beliefs then break down and are broken down in various beliefs that we will find uttered in the gospel and in Paul's letters.
So we got a super chat question from James Valiant. Thank you for your super chat. How can we know if the Apostolicon is the original Paul or a creation of Marcion himself?
James, thanks for a very insightful question. Well, first of all, I would say we don't know. However, having said that, I think we can know more than just saying we don't know. How is that possible? It's interesting, first of all, that against what I've just said, what I've taken from the preface to his New Testament, some of the texts that he has preserved as letters of Paul are sometimes in tension, I think, with his own intention. Let me just give you just a short idea to those people who are not familiar as much as you are with the letter collection of Marcion, the Pauline letter collection. First of all, I think he simply called it apostles, that it is apostolic. Apostolicon is already a title which the heresiologists give to the collection. He believes these are the words of the apostle, who is Paul. Now, what are these letters? He has collected 10 letters. And here starts why I think it is not just a product like a Shakespearean drama. Why do I believe that? First of all, because he has collected within these 10 letters that he brought together, 3 letters, which also feature in his collection together. And this is 2 Thessalonians, Colossians, and a letter that he knows to be a letter to the Laodiceans. A letter that today we know by the name of Ephesians, because in our canonical text, we have as addressees the church in Ephesus. Whereas in his collection, this is a letter that's being addressed to the Laodiceans. Both cities in Asia Minor, but different cities. Laodicea, certainly the less known city than Ephesus, who is a big, and at the time already, a big capital city. Now, these 3 letters are in many ways, as scholarship today admits, different from those remaining 7 other letters, all claiming that they are written by Paul. But today's scholarship believes that only the 7 letters, not these 3, are of Pauline origin, whereas the 3 they call Deutero-Pauline. Deutero because some students of Paul or an environment around Paul seem to have developed Pauline ideas, however, in a very different form. For example, we find a pre-existence of the Lord. We find apocalyptic material. We find reasonings about the eons, about Saturn, and. So we have those elements. And then in 2 Thessalonians, of course, we have almost like a rewriting of 1 Thessalonians, because we have parallel texts in both these letters. And in 2 Thessalonians, it is a correction of the belief that the Lord's second coming is imminent. So first of all, one can see that the person who has brought together these 10 letters has also brought together letters which are not entirely consistent with each other. Had Marcion written 10 letters of Paul. He would have been quite stupid if he had written a first letter to the Thessalonians to then add a second letter that in some ways disputes what he has written to the Thessalonians in the first letter. So discrepancies within the collection rather speak for material that Marcion has adopted. This was an argument from content, but I could go more deeply into the lexicography of these letters, something I'm not the first to have noticed. But people who have looked into the style of these letters have seen, one example, sentence lengths. We know that Ephesians and Colossians, to some extent Second Thessalonians, that these letters have the longest phrases in the entire New Testament. So these are warms. I mean, they run and run and run. They run over 7, sometimes over 10, sometimes over 20 verses in our Greek New Testament. You won't notice that if you have an English translation, because usually translators cut these long, non-ending sentences in smaller sections, so then that the readers can better digest them. But if you look into the Greek text, it's incredible how they go on and on and on and on. So we have a typical language style. And the same I noticed when I looked into the semantics and in the lexic itself. So we have a number of terms that only appear in these 3 letters. And all of these observations, which I'm not the first to do, have led scholarship to decide that those 3 letters are of a separate author from the other 7 letters of Paul. So I think a first idea that Marcion is integrating material that he found, and it looks very much that the 3 letters, 2 Thessalonians, Laodiceans, and Colossians, had already formed a certain letter collection which he integrated. And that doesn't mean that he simply added it to his own collection, but as every collector of a letter collection does, he seems to also have redacted these 3 letters. If he has done that, and I think there are very good reasons to believe that, because we can see consistencies in lexicography, despite the fact what I've said before, that we see differences, but we also see overlaps between the 3 letters and the 7 letters, which is a bit confusing, but it is the nature of a redaction that you adopt alien material and make it fit to other material that you have. And this obscures, of course, the nature of those 7 letters that he integrated too. So what we have to reckon with is that just like he had found the 3-letter collection, he seems to have integrated, and now I'm a bit at a loss whether he had integrated already an existing 7-letter collection, or as it appears to me, that he rather went out and collected individual, if not letters, at least material for these letters. That he didn't have another collection of 7 needs probably to be researched in further studies. But from the differences of these letters, I draw that again, he wasn't the one who simply wrote them, but because of the similarities in style in many ways, he must have thoroughly revised those letters. Still in these letters, in those 7, as much as in the 3, we can find indications and material where he seems to have struggled with. There are mentions, for example, of judgment. He sometimes refers these indications that there is mention not of the supreme divine, who he thinks is not a judge, but is rather a restorer. But he needs to interpret some of the passages, which probably Tertullian is right when saying, if one reads that at face value, you would read it as a belief into the Jewish God. That sometimes sounds almost like also a belief in a creator, and yet it's never outspoken. So one can read some of these text passages in light of Marcion's belief, and sometimes in light of the older Jewish belief. Whether Marcion has revised these texts in a way that he cut out those references to the creator and just left things like he was all in all, or he was the one who delivered, or who was the source of all and for all, so not mentioning the creation, we don't know. So to come back to your question, it is pretty difficult, I think, for us at the moment, but I've just completed the reconstruction, so we will see how the discussion in the next weeks and months is going to go. But I think it's not an easy task to find an original Paul underneath the Marcionite version of Paul. Quite different, of course, and quite clear is that the Paul we know from the canonical collection of Paul is far away from any original Paul. So if you ask whether what we've got is the creation of Marcion, indeed, this is the version that we have. We have a Marcionite version of Paul in those 10 letters. That it's not simply a creation by Marcion, I think, is also coming to the fore, that Marcion relies on some earlier material, which we may retrace through the collection of Marcion, but that is at the moment with great difficulties. What we have got is a Marcionite Paul as it stands, and a canonical Paul, and this canonical Paul is certainly further away from any historical Paul than the Marcionite Paul can be. But what is behind the Marcionite 7 letters and the 3 letters will be an interesting discussion. It will also be an interesting discussion if the 3 letters are closer to a historical Paul than the 7 letters. And it will be another discussion whether any of these writings, the 3 letters and the 7 letters, go back to a historical Paul, or whether that's rather a chimera in the background. So we are not on the channel of Myth Vision here, without stating that. But I think we cannot simply infer, because we have material from 7 letters and material from the 3-letter collection, to deduce from that behind these overall 10 letters, we have a historical personality by the name of Paul. That's something where future discussions may uncover a bit more.
Patristica, Dr. Jack Bull, thank you for your super chat. Do you think Marcion had many followers?
Probably that was the biggest issue for all commentators and writers to, about, and against Marcion in the 2nd century. He was the most successful of the early Christian teachers by far. You can see that in a work like Justin, where Justin complains that he is ridiculed by people who compare the many followers of Marcion with the few students Justin has. Then we have Hippolytus' statement and Clement of Alexandria, and they know, Clement says, Marcion is the oldest of the teachers of Christians who moved into Rome in the 2nd century after the Jewish War. The oldest at the same time means the most established and the most authoritative one. Then we have the statements that by Tertullian that most of the communities, most of the churches that he knows of were churches who had adopted the Marcionite views. So that is an easy answer. And then we also know that it was claimed that Marcion's churches had the biggest number of martyrs. Why? Because these were an ascetic movement or ascetic churches. People who had renounced marriage and were prepared to die without retribution, without any fight. So I think there is an enormous pacifism within that movement, which goes back, of course, to the new Torah of the mountain, of the sermon from the plain. So yes, I think in the 2nd century, Marcion, which is not a surprise if he is at the beginning of this new cult, at the beginning of what he terms Christianity. And even if you think, if he was the one who coined the new name, Christianity as a self-description, if it is true from what we can see in Justin, in Irenaeus and Tertullian, that all of these people, and not just the three or the rest as well, never ever know of a New Testament unlike they refer to Marcion's collection. So if Marcion has coined the name Christianity, if the name of New Testament goes back to him, and if Köster, famous Helmut Köster, New Testament scholar in the States, if he's right, and I think he is right, that even the name of Evangelion, of gospel, goes back to Marcion, then you can see this early Christian movement was in the first wave a Marcionite form of cult practice. Only in the next development of the next 20, 30, 40 years, this form of an early Christian cult, which is Marcionite, transforms itself by reintegrating themselves into the Jewish heritage. And that starts, and no surprise, with a big dialogue between Justin and a Jewish dialogue partner that potentially he has created, Trypho. And this entire dialogue is an explanation why Justin believes that, unlike Marcion, Christianity is not an opposition to Judaism, but is the heir of Judaism, is Verus Israel, is true Israel. And therefore, that the entire Jewish tradition belongs to Christians. So I think what we have to revise in our minds is, no, Marcion has never been a heretic. Nobody says so during his lifetime. He was not the arch heretic. I think he was, if you like, the founder of this new cult. The founder, not in the sense that he has no predecessors. Of course, as I said, he has these traditions on which he bases himself. But in terms of a starter, of an organizer, I think he is the entrepreneur who is a cult founder of Christianity. So instead of asking, did he have many followers? No, there were, I think, few other people within this kind of an beginning of an institutionalized Christianity, that there were a number of people who had some knowledge about Jesus, who had some knowledge about Paul, some knowledge about what happened in the first century. We can assume that too. But they might have been around in Asia Minor, they might have been around in Palestine, they might have been around in Rome, in Alexandria, and in other places. But the first institutionalized form of Christianity I'm talking about, yeah, for this type of a beginning, Marcion is certainly the one. So if we have followers of Christianity, these were Marcion's followers. And that changes dramatically over the next 20, 30, and 40 years.
So what caused Marcion to be deemed a heretic? What caused him to get excommunicated from the church during his lifetime?
Sorry, Jacob, to correct you, because this is heresiology from the 4th century, not even from the 3rd century, let alone from the 2nd century. As far as we can historically know, Marcion was never hereticized, nor was he excluded or excommunicated during his lifetime. The sources are unanimous that he was at his peak in the times of the Roman Emperor Antoninus Pius. Now, Antoninus Pius became emperor after Hadrian the emperor had died in 138 of our era. And Antoninus Pius passed away in 161 when Mark Aurel picked up the emperorship. So when Mark Aurel in 168 became emperor, from what we know from our sources, Marcion must have just passed away too. What do we know about the times of his lifetime? The only and the earliest person to speak about him having been excluded from the church is Tertullian. So Irenaeus doesn't know about it. Justin doesn't know about it. From the fragments that we have and the information that we have about those 12 books written about him, against him, and to him, we have no indication that he was excluded from the church. Now, what is Tertullian, our first source, saying? He says, and he talks in his De Prescriptione, that's one of the works, he talks about Valentinus, another Roman teacher, and Marcion, that they had been excluded from the community not semel, not once, but a number of times. That by itself makes one worry as a historian what it means to have been excluded not only once but several times, which cannot mean that there was a clear disruption between Valentinus, Marcion, and the Roman community if they had come in backwards. Now, more interesting is that Tertullian says that this kind of exclusion of several exclusions of these two teachers took place in the reign of the Roman bishop Eleuterus. Why is that strange? Because, as we know, Eleuterus was bishop of Rome in the times of Irenaeus of Lyon, which means in the times of around 177, 180 something. And that means our earliest source to claim some form of multiple exclusions from the Roman community of Marcion plus Valentinus locates that kind of exclusion 20 years minimum after Marcion's death. That would mean during his lifetime, we have no information about him being excluded at all. Tertullian's view that he was excluded several times 20 years after his death is also problematic. Why? We have a letter exchange in the 3rd century, in the mid 3rd century, so around 248, 250, between the Bishop of Rome at the time, Stephen, and the Bishop of Carthage, the famous Cyprian of Carthage. Why famous? Because we have a big letter collection of Cyprian that survived, including a letter that was written by Stephen to him. And Stephen complains. He says, you shouldn't be as rigorous as you are, because we in Rome, we have community with a variety of other people. And then he mentions those other communities. Amongst them are the Novatians, another form who takes back to Novatian, a presbyter in Rome. And then he also mentions, and the communities of the Marcionites. And he says we have a Eucharistic communion with them. Baptism and the Eucharist, we're together. We're not excluding each other. Now, I think this kind of a testimony is more valuable and more historically reliable. It comes from Rome and not from Carthage, where Tertullian is being located. And it seems that the Carthaginian church is a more rigorous church. And one of the big and famous biographers of Tertullian has stated Tertullian seems to know very little about the church in Rome, that you will find in Timothy Barnes' book on Tertullian. Because most of what he says about the Roman church is wrong anyway. So he has no real knowledge. And that would explain that him claiming that Valentinus and Marcion had been excluded from the Roman community, let alone 20 years after his death, was made up for hereticizing in the 3rd century a figure who had been dead for quite a few decades.
So why did they just suddenly decide that they want to hereticize Marcion so long after his death? Was it because his ideas wasn't fitting the new system, the new church that was arising?
I think you hit the nail on the head. Yeah, we have to think historically. When Marcion made his move, as Clement of Alexandria and others stated, after the end of the Second Jewish War, which is after the year 135, when he then moved from Asia Minor into Rome to settle there, to create his didaskalion, his classroom in which he was starting to teach, apparently on the basis of this New Testament that he had brought along and developed there. His views that this type of teaching that he taught and this kind of religious practice that he practiced fitted the historical moment. He suggested a pacifist religious movement close to Jews, but different from the Pharisaic form of Judaism. Why did he make that kind of a rupture between Judaism and Christianity? Because not only him, but people in the Roman Empire had experienced a revolution of Jews against the Romans that was like none before. You may say, well, there was a first Jewish revolt. There was in the years 117 a second Jewish revolt in Alexandria. In the first Jewish revolt that most of us know of, in the years around 66, 68, the Romans took victory, leveled the temple, destroyed the temple, had an enormous victorious march. We can still see that in the Titus column, which is still in Rome, where you can see how the Romans, the soldiers, carry all the riches from the Temple of Jerusalem to Rome. The Colosseum has been built by Titus based on those riches, based on the money that they took from the Temple of Jerusalem. So they celebrated for months on months this great victory. Quite the opposite was the end of the Second Jewish War in 135. As Suetone and others let us know, Hadrian, in his last year of his life, had to admit to his Senate that, contrary to all his predecessors, the war was lost. Even so, that the Jews were defeated, it was seen from the Roman side as a defeat of the Roman army and the emperor. And Suetone mentions that in the entire history of Rome, this was the first time an emperor admits defeat. So we have an enormous repercussion. No celebrations of that defeat of the Jews, no celebration of the end of the war, but it was the decision of Hadrian to drive out every circumcised male, and with it the entire Jewish, and including Jewish Christian, communities from Jerusalem and its surrounding. So only at that very moment, Jews had to reorganize and rethink themselves anew. Now, not only the temple was lost, their central holy city was lost, the core of what Judaism was. That Christians at that crucial moment start their own Christian form of Jewish belief by rejecting their attachment to those revolutionaries and to that tradition that instigated this terrible war, that didn't want to have anything to do with these prophets who had prophesied of rebuilding the temple, one of the reasons for creating the revolution against the Romans. That they didn't want to have anything to do with a form of Messiah who wants to restate and instate the nation of the Israelites. So it was an apt moment, I think, for Christians to start their own religion that had a new foundation with the New Testament, a new Messiah who was a universalist Messiah. So he was in a form of a form of Judaism, if you like, that was aligned, very closely related to the aspirations that the Romans had for themselves. So it was an attempt to let these uncircumcised Christians, and those were the ones who were left in Jerusalem, left in the diaspora around Jerusalem, and also left in many, many places in Asia Minor. Hence, these people also going and coming to Rome and teaching the new form of a cult that integrated Jewish elements, but saw themselves as non-revolutionary linked. Pacifists, different form, universalists, harmony-oriented, and. So there is an apt moment at the time, but as we can reckon over time, as after the wall had come down in Berlin, 10, 20 years, 30 years later, the world changes. the alliances changes, the needs change. If we had placed an invasion into Ukraine by a totalitarian Russia, that changes alliances. Who could have believed that Sweden, Finland joined the NATO? Countries that have for a very long time been outside of all alliances. And you can see how the political and social demographic changes. And I think this is so important to see that in the years after 155, 160, when Justin is writing, he also seeks the alliance to Rome, but now he makes the claim, we need to be Verus Israel, true Israel, to be accepted by the Roman state again. So Rome has apparently forgotten about those years of the revolt. And Jews had enjoyed, again, slowly at least, the privileges that they had for hundreds of years. And Christians try to emulate now that they are also under the cover of these privileges. They are an accepted religion in the Roman Empire, despite the revolutions. But still, Jews were accepted as a religion. It wasn't regarded as a new form of superstition against which the Roman state was very, very cautious, even to the point of persecuting people. And particularly under Mark Aurel, so in the years between 160 and 180, when, because of the Black Death, that was one of the big pandemics at the time, Mark Aurel started persecuting not just Christians, but all these kind of superstitious groupings, because they didn't support the state, but rather undermined it. There was a good reason for Christians to claim that they are indeed aligned, and even the heirs, and even the continuation of Jews. So we can see within those 30, 40 years, we have a different world in the years of 170, 180 than we had in the 130s.
And so I'd like to shift to what you mentioned in your book on Marcion and the dating of the Synoptic Gospels. You talk about that Irenaeus seems to suggest that Luke Acts was written in response to Marcion's antithesis, or Acts at least was. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. It is interesting that Acts has, and we have a good number of scholars who have looked into the question, that Acts has no mention, but that is an argument from silence. But it is a strong argument because we have quite a number of writings in the 2nd century, but nobody knows of Acts. I mean, even doesn't hint at Acts. The very first one is somebody who is close to Irenaeus of Lyon, and that is Dionysius of Corinth. And it's, for the question you ask, it is no surprise that Dionysius of Corinth, of whom we have information about 8 letters that he has written, one of the core topics, and even he mentions the name, was Marcion of Sinope. He writes in one of the letters that one shouldn't adopt this kind of an ascetic form of Christians that was preached by Marcion. He writes to one of his bishops in Crete called Pinitus, and he admonishes this bishop that he shouldn't be as ascetic as he wants to be. So clearly aligning him with the views of Marcion. And what is so interesting is that Pinitus writes back, and this is a letter that is also not preserved, but the information about it is preserved in Eusebius. Penitus writes back to Dionysius and complains about, not Marcion, but complains about Dionysius's request. And he says, you shouldn't ask me to teach a form of Christianity which is made like milk for children. I'm dealing with adults. And so I have to insist on these type of rigorous Christian asceticism. So he supports and maintains a Marcionite position in letters of Dionysius, where Dionysius writes against Marcion, which brings us back to the question that we had earlier, how many followers? So we can see even in the 170s, around the time of Irenaeus, we have a strong support by bishops who are of the Orthodox tradition, who are being addressed by people like Dionysius. And here in this letter, in one of the letters, Dionysius refers to a passage from Acts to make and support himself in stating that this anti-Marcionite position that he is proposing is being substantiated by Christian writings. So we can see the first ever use where we know of that Acts is deployed is in an anti-Marcionite discourse. Very similar, not me alone, but very similar people who have worked on Acts before me have long seen that the Pauline figure, one of the biggest protagonists in this work, I mean, from chapter 8, at the latest from chapter 9, almost entire work of Acts is about Paul. And yet, it is a soft painting of Paul's portrait compared to his letters. The letters that Marcion collected, so the Pauline profile that Marcion provided Christianity with, these letters are never, ever mentioned in Acts. Acts writes about Paul as he had never written a single letter. Acts, however, provides scholarship and readers with a number of hints. So the person who has written Acts seems to have known letters by Paul, but consciously left any mention and reference to these letters away. In contrast, the portrait is being given through the book of Acts in the many speeches that Paul delivers. In those speeches where he makes mention to the tradition of Israel. So he is seen as somebody who is a pious Jewish member who practices Jewish laws, who claims that Christians have to continue the Jewish tradition, makes references to the Jewish writings and so forth. And so we can see that the picture that's being depicted in Acts fits the picture that Dionysius of Corinth needs to counteract Marcion. And when we look then into the collection, we can see that Acts never appears in manuscript form anyway, never appears together with Luke. It always appears together with another set of letters. So Acts, I think we need to conceptualize also within the collection of the New Testament as part of a sub-collection, which later on in the Byzantine area is called Prax Apostolos, so the practice of the apostles. So it's a combination of Acts plus what we call the Catholic letters. And Catholic letters, by which we mean the epistle of Jacob or James, the epistle of Jude, 2 epistles of Peter, and 3 epistles of John. These were packaged together. And In the collection of the New Testament, as far as we know, at least in some of our mega codices that we have from the 4th and 5th centuries, Acts with these letters have been placed after the subcollection of the 4 Gospels. So for the readers who were reading through the New Testament, the canonical New Testament, they didn't go, as in Marcion's New Testament, from the Gospel to the letters of Paul, but they went from reading the Gospels into reading Acts, encountering Paul there, and the development of the church, where Paul is the big missionary in the names of the apostles. He himself is not named apostle in Acts. These are the 12, not Paul. But Paul is an envoy from the community in Antioch. And as such, he is the missionary in Acts. And now you understand that after Acts, we first read then the 7 letters of the Catholic letters. So we come into reading the big apostles' letters. And only after these letters, then we encounter in the canonical New Testament the 14 letters of Paul, before we come then to the end of Revelation. So you can see there is a whole plot which is not just a anti-Marcionite nature of Acts, but that Acts as a compound works to move from the Gospels and at the end to Paul. When we think, was Acts originally written for this purpose? That is a difficult question. But I think because Acts has as its major personality, which is being described throughout Acts by the name of Paul, I think from the beginning, it seems that Acts was purposefully written in order to integrate the 7 letters of Paul and to accommodate them within the New Testament. But first, that people have to put on the glasses of Acts to then be able to read Paul. And this is precisely as Tertullian indicates and tells us in his books against Marcion, where he says, when I read Acts, then I can digest Paul. In other words, take away Acts, and Paul wouldn't have made it into the canonical New Testament.
Neophyte 1, thank you for your super chat. An epistemic question. History often depends on copies of texts that are millennia removed from their original. How can we justify using such texts?
Well, that is a difficult question, of course, for any historian. If we were to reject or to say, no, we are not justified using such texts, there would not be any historiography. But I would agree with you. The question indicates that we have to be reflective upon what we do as historians. And I've published in 2019 a book writing the history of early Christianity, drawing attention to the methodological question, this epistemic question, as to call it, right? How can we justify using such texts? And the subtitle of this book is From Reception to Retrospection. And I'm claiming that what we usually do, and that's a big hindrance of us historians to, and by making use of such texts, the big hindrance is that we are so informed from the texts as we read them and from the long tradition that derives from these texts in concreto, that, for example, Jacob asks me about the heresy of Marcion. And that, for example, we have in the headline of our session today, the origins of a heretic, meaning that people usually think of Marcion as a heretic, informed by such texts. So your epistemic question is absolutely right. We have this problem of reception, that we receive these texts and give credit and authority to these texts. Whereas, for example, Jason Bedoun, in his book, The First New Testament, which is an English translation of his reconstruction of Marcion's New Testament, at least the Gospel and the Pauline letters, where he says in his introduction that we have to be extremely cautious by making use of such texts. Now, why and how can we approach in a more cautious way these reports about Marcion, including the reports about his texts? That's one of the major topics of Judith Lear's great book. We have to first understand what is the intention of somebody like Irenaeus or Tertullian. And anything that he reports about his opponent, which suits him and his intention. For example, when Tertullian says he has been excluded together with Valentinus several times from the church. That suits him, of course, and his intention. And everything that suits his intention, which he reports, we have to be skeptical. However, there are a number of elements which Irenaeus, just as Tertullian, gives us, which do not suit their intentions. I give you an example from Irenaeus. Irenaeus says that already Marcion had questioned the traditional, or had questioned whether Irenaeus' position is traditional. So he made a claim that his views are the views that he had encountered in the tradition of the texts and of the people. And that Irenaeus was the one who changed the tradition, who introduced things which were not part of that tradition as Marcion had it. Another example is Tertullian. Tertullian reports or creates a fictive dialogue between Marcion and himself. And in this dialogue, he explains that Marcion would claim for his New Testament and Gospel that he has got the right one and the old one, the first one. Tertullian says, I'm of the same opinion. I believe that my New Testament and my Gospel is the oldest. And you can see it goes against the intention, of course, of Tertullian. Why would he invent the claim of Marcion, his opponent, to claim priority, greater authenticity, just as an Irenaeus, greater and longer traditionality? So with these types of information, I think we have to read through the lines, becoming, as Jason says, skeptical if we are told what works for the contestants. That doesn't mean that everything that they claim against their own intention is naturally historically right. So we have to be cautious on both sides. But I think because we're only left with the winners of history, we have to look through these documents of the winners to see whether we can still unearth the silenced voices of the losers. And this is a type of an epistemic question which does not only apply to early Christian scholars. It applies to people who do Holocaust studies or genocide studies. It is hard to read through the winners and the perpetrators' documents to unearth the voices which have lost out in history.
Dr. Bilby, thank you for your super chat. What YouTube channels would you recommend for up-to-date scholarship on Marcion?
I think at the moment we have, fortunately, a number of channels that are springing up, which is a very good sign. Here, of course, I have to say Jacob's history channel is amongst the number ones. But we have also a new channel where I'm part of, and Mark, yourself, and Jack Bull, which is called Patristica. It's just been relaunched, and I think we try to provide in the next weeks and months an up-to-date of the scholarship as far as we progress in our research, because you have to understand what I'm talking about today is created up to the moment we go live. This is scholarship in progress. And then we had a few appearances on Myth channel, on Myth Vision. Derek has a great channel too. And there are a few more. If you just see what Jacob here has done together with Jack and a few other colleagues together, I think it is great that we don't see each other as competitors in this field, but rather as diversifying people. And look, this is so close to how I envisage, and maybe I'm misled by that experience, but I think it is what I can see in the sources of the 2nd century. These scholars like Marcion, Justin, and others, Valentinus, Ptolemaeus, you name them. These were people who all knew each other. The world then was not bigger than today. I'd say even a bit smaller. They all knew each other's. They had their channels. And so it's not surprising that the gospel that Marcion had on his channel and the 10 letters of Paul ended up the next day in another channel, Mark's channel, Luke's channel, whatever you called them, right? As little as Patreon is the name of, or History Channel is the name of Jacob, and Patreon the name of Mark and Jack and me. As little as Luke the name of the channel where the Gospel of Marcion appeared in a different form. So they didn't understand each other as enemies. They saw themselves in a brilliant way as communicators for a different audience in a different way, competitors in some ways, but in a good way, in the sense of creating a movement and creating and inspiring each other. It turned sour, I think, because the historical situation had changed towards the end of the 2nd century, as I mentioned before. And that's always bad. It's always bad when people who are of different opinion starting to denigrate the others. Then Marcion becomes a demon, and I hope we won't get as far as that with all our channels. So I think there's great stuff at the moment on YouTube, and the beauty of these types of channels is you get quicker to the research results than the people who have to wait for the printing presses to bring out our books, let alone it's much more expensive to buy the books than to have it here. Another channel, last channel I'm mentioning here is academia.edu. People question why academia.edu was ever given the extension edu. They're right. It's not a state, it's not a university or an academic endeavor. It was a clever move early in the days. I still remember when he started the channel. But academia.edu is the channel where you will find free of charge mostly the draft papers, but also sometimes published papers and even monographs, free of charge for download or just for reading. And it's a type of open access which I'm delighted that they exist. Probably GitHub is another one, a repository where you can find computing or computer readable and readable material, which I also can recommend. And in that sense, I think, Mark, you're the specialist, meant much more than I ever can be.
Bob Dobbs, thank you for your super chat. MacDonald cites mimetic pericopes not existent in the Gospel, the Lord, that appear in both Mark and Luke as evidence that Marcion is a redaction of Luke. Comment?
I don't think that these mimetic pericopes are an evidence that Marcion is a redaction of Luke. I rather think it's the other way around. But look, as always in the synoptic studies, you're at a loss if you're only dealing with text internal arguments. If text internal arguments would work, we had, after 180 years of synoptic studies with thousands of monographs, let alone hundreds of thousands of articles, we would have at least some kind of unanimous view, even if we had disagreements at the edges, but a unanimous view on the general draft and the general line, how these four texts belong together. Now, with the addition of the Marcionite gospel, I think the question and the answers will become even a bit more complex. What I notice, of course, are mimetic pericopes. But then you also have some mimetic pericopes. We just had Mark on the channel here with his question. He worked on these types of mimetic pericopes. And if I've understood him correctly, they existed to some extent also in the Marcionite gospel. There are differences in the intensity that these mimetic pericopes exist in the various texts. But we better ask Mark, because he is a specialist on these details. Sorry, Bob. I don't think that there is enough ground for making Marcion a redaction of Luke, because it is a beauty to have Matthias Klinghardt as a prime witness. When in 2010 I invited him to give a talk in a seminar in Oxford at the Patristics Conference, it was then in 2011, the conference, he was a staunch defender of Marcion being after Mark. He admitted already that he might be before Luke, and that Luke is a redaction of Marcion's gospel. But he still defended the primary authority of Mark. For the next 4 years after that seminar, he dug into the text and he compared the synoptics. He did a reconstruction of Marcion's gospel. It is the first thorough, and probably until today, still one of the authoritative texts reconstructions. And in the baseline, of course, he has a bit more text than, let's say, Jason Bedoun, and many more text than Harnack and Dieter Roth. But still, they come together in a harmony with regards to the witnessed texts. And this Matthias Klinghardt shows, for example, in this bolded text. So he admits what he thinks is witnessed for. And there they align all of the reconstructions of the Marcionite gospel. And yet, at the end of his exercise, after 4 years' work, he comes and calls his book the earliest gospel. So clearly showing in very detailed manner how Luke is a redaction of this text. And just 2 years before he had published his book, Jason Bedoun has published his reconstruction of Marcion's New Testament, not in Greek, but at least in an English translation. And he calls it the first New Testament, also showing that Luke is a redaction of Marcion's text. So it is an experience that people who even come from a different opinion after having worked through the material, are convinced not by Vinzent or not by somebody else, are convinced like I had been convinced by the material itself. So it's no revelation, it's work, hard work, and being, as a scholar, open to what the material tells us. So that brings us back to the question which has just been asked. How can we sift through this material with such open eyes that it's still against what the material sometimes tries to say, because this is heresiological substance? We still can find different people. Matthias did his research without me interfering in any way, but coming to those results as Jason Bedoun came, and I became as well.
So in my closing question, when you look at Marcion's antithesis, some ask, how can one not see Marcion as a heretic? When you look at this, like, it's Christianity doesn't believe these kind of things that Marcion says he believed in the antithesis, that Jesus is the son of a different God, and that the God of the Old Testament is not the father of Jesus. How do you respond to that?
This is a nice proof of how we are conditioned. Of course, after almost 2,000 years of Christian history, and making a judgment today on the basis that this is across the denominations, just what you've said, is what Christianity is about. He is a heretic. But then the origin is not the 2nd century. The origin is the 21st century, or we might say the 4th century or the 3rd century. So it depends on what kind of standard we apply when we define what Christianity is. If we do a retrospection, then we can see that in the mid-2nd century, this type of definition did not exist. Hence, we cannot judge him against something which later on would make him a heretic. It was a definition in the making, of which he was fundamental, and to which he was fundamental too. Now, would he have been a heretic or a problem already within the Jewish community? That is a big debate. Again, in the late 2nd century and in the 3rd century onwards, people who believed what he believed were regarded by Jews as what we would call heretics, as non-Jews. Was that already the case at his time? I would doubt so. I'll give you an example. When we look into Philo of Alexandria, whose Jewishness, I think, again today, is under no dispute. He was born 40 years before Christ ever walked the earth. Now, he believed in 2 forms of creation: in the 7 days, and what is being reported in the book of Genesis from chapter 2, verse 4 onwards. And people have for a long time seen that the first book of the Torah, the book of Genesis, reports the creation of this world twice. Now, in the first report of the 7 days, on the first day, Philo sees God himself at work. Only the transcendent God of the Jews. However, this God created only what he calls a cosmos noetos, which translates as a cosmos of ideas. So he was, in this sense, a Platonist. So he believed that this divine figure, who he worshipped as Yahweh, as the God of Israel, that this God was only capable of creating ideas, but not matter, not substance. No computers, no laptop, no bodies, no physicalities, no ears and no eyes, no mouth and no nose. Only what we would call, because we are all Aristotelian, non-matter, numinous, noetoi, ideas. And then he says in the second report, where it states that God mixed body and saliva and to create human beings. This is not something this divine God has done. That is the mixture with cosmos, sarkikos, fleshly cosmos. And this cosmos was not done by the divine. This is a creation which was done by not a demon, but a power of God, the hand of God, a logos. So he, as a Platonic thinker, differentiated already between the most divine, who couldn't create, at least not the cosmos, and certainly not flesh, but who had his helping hands like angels. Plato talked about the creation of this world in the very same sense, calling it a demiurge, the demiurgos. Even Justin, we mentioned him before, he believes in two gods. He says we have a first God who is the absolute transcendent God. He doesn't do this type of creation. But there is a second God, a deuteros God, a second God. That's the logos. And that's the one who creates. And you can see that the difference between Marcion's belief, Philo's, the Jew, and Justin, the Christian, is not between black and white. We're talking about nuances in beliefs. They all believe that this, and this is typically a middle Platonic, they all believed that the absolute transcendent God could not himself create this cosmos. Philo even says, if God had created this cosmos, he would have destroyed it, because how can a non-physical being stand the physical being? It's like us even looking into the sun, it would burn us. So physicality cannot bear the bare hands of the divine. And that is what mediation means. And you can see Marcion's belief in the middle of the 2nd century was not so far off from Jewish beliefs. But we have to contextualize our people to see that only through discussion in the 2nd century, then Christians come to the view that, not even in the 2nd century, that in the 3rd and 4th century and later, that this type of Christian belief is off-road from Jews and off-road from themselves, linking back to a type of Judaism, which was also off-road from Philo, because Philo then has never been transmitted in the next hundreds of years through the Jewish tradition, but only through Christian. So Christians could embrace this type of Middle Platonic Jewish belief. Rabbinic Judaism couldn't. So would we say Philo of Alexandria was a heretic as well? Well, in terms of the rabbis, he was. And that's why they didn't copy him. In terms of Christians, he was not. He was even seen as a saint, as somebody who was later becoming a church father. Hence, we have to be very careful when we see the complexity. And that explains again why what Marcion believed sounds today as a heretic view. But in the 2nd century, it was part of the exploration, how to formulate within the philosophical and within the arena of the religious practice, how to formulate best what we experience. And in one sense, I think it was very hard for these people to believe that a divine could create not only a physical world, but a world where, like in the Second Jewish War, the world tended to collapse and to destroy themselves.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Markus Vinzent.
As always, a pleasure. And I crack on with the final touches to the reconstruction of the 10-letter collection. And we might have another chat at another point, more about
Absolutely.
Marcion, Paul.
I look forward to it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.